Now, John Ryan has been, he's been considered a drug expert for many years, both in his personal life, his professional life. He's been known, I actually say this in all seriousness, he, for decades, has been a leader in conversations around drug use and around drug law reform, and in particularly about minimising the harm of it. Now, as the CEO of the Pennington Institute, they have, and the namesake, Professor Pennington, also had a strong interest in cannabis law reform. But the Pennington Institute over the last 2 years has been producing and publishing some really expert insights into cannabis policy and cannabis in Australia today. And John, you're going to show us some slides and present some of those slides first, and then we will sit down and have a chat. Over to you, Mr. Ryan.
Thanks very much, Fiona, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I do have some slides, I thought.
Here they are.
Wow, amazing. That's interesting. That's even better. So I probably won't speak too much about Pennington Institute. It was a very generous introduction from Fiona. I wanted to briefly touch on some of the sentiment in the community, and that's very close to the heart of Pennington Institute. We're obviously very interested in evidence-based practice, but equally interested in the lived experience of people in the community. There's a lot of conflicting evidence, as David mentioned. There's a lack of consensus, even in the expert community, about which way to go forward, and there's also a real backlog of evidence-based opportunities for governments to implement that they haven't implemented. And I think that's partly why the lived experience element is so important in policy making, and it's often those politicians that have some personal experience in these issues that are champions for change. Excuse me. There's an interesting sort of journey that a lot of people go on, I guess, in life. I've been on that journey myself, which is changing your mind about things. And I reckon when I was looking at this slide, it really reminded me of about the time when I kind of flipped in relation to cannabis. I was for a long time thinking that we, whilst not able to police our way out of these problems, should be able to health intervention our way out of these problems, and could do it within a, what's typically referred to as decriminalisation, or even within criminalisation still have an enhanced health response. Methamphetamine changed my mind about that, and the tradition of illicit drugs under the regime that we've got, the global regime, is that they do become more potent, more dangerous and more numerous. Like the number of new drugs that are entering the market is extraordinary, but the methamphetamine shock to the Australian system really reinforced to me how we need to be treating drugs according to their harm profile. And when we think about the harm profile, the sentiment in the community, I think, is pretty accurate, which is that for some reason we've bundled cannabis up with other substances that definitely need a different approach. The challenge, I think, is it's not a harmless drug. It's obviously a very beneficial drug in many circumstances, but community sentiment has really taken off, interestingly, about the same time as methamphetamine arrived, actually. Or it might be that the frugals, my parents' generation, were sort of shuffling off this mortal coil, and they were the ones that were the most subject to, I think, fear campaigns in relation to drug use issues. Many of us slightly younger people have our own personal experience of drug use ourselves, or within our family and social networks, and so cannabis is a real outlier, I think, amongst current illicit drugs in Australia, because so many of the Australian community have consumed it at least once in their life, and that includes members of Parliament from across the political spectrum. They often whisper that they are supportive of significant change but they're not willing to put their head above the parapet like some of the people in this room. The support data in the US is better than ours in terms of time period, and to be honest, that 10% is almost the reverse now. So there's about 10% of people that still think that it should be criminalised and it has no medicinal benefit. But generally the American trajectory has been towards ever-growing support for a different and more nuanced approach to cannabis regulation. This is maybe a little bit hard to read, but it basically shows, I think, that the sky doesn't fall in. And what we do have, I think, is a lot of political inertia in relation to drug policy more generally, including cannabis. And one of the fears I think you can see is in politicians' eyes is trying to figure the sort of win out of change, the win for their re-election prospects, as well as a win for the community. And there's a fear that significant change will generate enormous backlash. I don't think the fear is justified based on the data that comes out of North America. It's amazing how much people, if you can read it, the tall, the 71 to 17 in Colorado or 69 to 20 in Oregon, that's the tall bars are a success only, or more of a success than a failure after regulation's been introduced. And so people not only think, as they do in Australia, that we should have a regulated adult use cannabis market, but for those jurisdictions that have actually implemented the change, it's still perceived to be a positive. And so where does that leave us in the Australian context? I think we've got some challenges that include a backlog of misinformation and fear in relation to substance use issues. We've got a very exciting media landscape, I think, to navigate. The experience in jurisdictions that I've looked at is that the media play an incredibly important part in informing the community about these issues, and if the media are shrill in relation to this, we've got a very significant problem. But all in all, I think the evidence is that the community continues to support a need for a decriminalised approach to these issues. That's the police that said a long time ago, we can't police our way out of these problems. That's not enough though. We really need a health frame, a public health frame response to these issues. And I think, honestly, it's people like David and colleague Rachel and others slowly but surely pushing the envelope. We will, I think, in the end, have a system that better reflects the evidence and the lived experience of people in Australia. And that was a quick tour through some sentiment. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Hello, well done. I think you posed, oh look, it's 4:20. You posed an interesting question at the end of those slides, but you didn't answer it. Would you like to? So the question was, for those who may not have had their glasses on, is how can Australia's inevitable regulation of cannabis best meet community needs and expectations?
I think it's a great question. I'm glad it was posed. I think it is difficult to think about the future, and I mean, I don't know how many people here are from Melbourne, but it was a rather hot weekend in Melbourne, and I kind of hid behind my shuttered windows and then went out to my garden this morning, which is basically sort of Armageddon.
Yeah.
So the cannabis model, to my mind, needs to have access for people that don't have green fingers, that don't have backyards, that live in neighbourhoods where security is more difficult. So the sort of standovers and theft that is typical of the illicit cannabis market doesn't get replicated in a decriminalised market, especially for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So somehow or other we've got to solve the problem of demand and supply, and I think that looks to me like some form of regulated access where you can outsource the production. The other challenge, I think, is protecting our protecting the health of our community, and there's a huge issue with cannabis dependence, and I think the other part of a regulated market is actually facing up to people in the community with cannabis use disorder or dependence and actually treating them as health patients and not as criminals. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity in a regulated market to better address some of the negative consequences of cannabis use and to address some of the very negative consequences of the prohibition model that we have been quite wedded to for a very long time.
In both your reports, you talk about the medicinal cannabis industry, and I think we've heard today, and I mean everybody in this room knows that we have seen a quite meteoric rise in the industry, the size of it, the number of participants and the number of patients. Is that a concern to? I mean, my question should be if we've got this meteoric rise in medicinal cannabis, do you think that is a response to the lack of a legal market?
Well, I think there's definitely lots of people from the illicit market who've gone across to the medicinal market, but they were treating their health conditions independently of any medical advice. So I think that's a shift that's actually really positive. And I think that, I don't know if I was misunderstanding the presentation from APRA before, but the opportunity with telehealth, to my mind, I can see that there are limitations with telehealth, but the great opportunity is people who are geographically isolated. And so maintaining telehealth access, I think, is really important for people who need healthcare and medicinal cannabis as part of that. The challenge, to my mind, is weeding out some of the dodgy players. That's really important, but the bigger issue is what's the backdrop of medicinal cannabis, and the backdrop is fear and loathing of cannabis, and I think there's an opportunity for community education about that, so that we do have people, particularly from newly arrived communities, non-English speaking background communities, understanding cannabis, medicinal cannabis, and how they can actually access it to improve their health conditions. I think there's a huge bit of community education that's missing, and that goes to addressing some of the myths in relation to illicit cannabis, such as there's some classic old ones that still are well believed, such as stepping stone theory. You start cannabis and you end up methamphetamine addicted in a flash, et cetera, et cetera. So I think similarly there's a lack of community understanding about how big the cannabis market is, how big the illicit cannabis market is, and how big the income for the underworld is in that business. There's a person assassinated this morning in a suburb with big houses. The allegation is that it's a sort of gangland-related event. Calabrian, you get the idea, Griffith sort of connections. That's something that we shouldn't be tolerating in the Australian community, when we can actually take out a major part of the illicit drug supply's income-generating potential. It's a lay-down misère.
Absolutely. We are handing over $1.24 billion in Victoria alone to criminal organisations. I just wanted to touch finally in the few seconds that we've got. You mentioned in the preface to your excellent report, and I would commend both the Pennington reports 2023, 2022 to everyone, using medicinal cannabis as a harm reduction tool. And I know Dr. Nick Linseiris also works in this area. Is this a new area, or are you finding more and more people in the harm reduction space recognising medicinal cannabis as a tool in harm reduction?
So I think it's really fascinating how treatment of cannabis use disorder hasn't been a big part of medicinal cannabis from the get-go, and there are some voices now and some published peer-reviewed literature supporting that approach. I think it's a huge opportunity. We've seen with opioid substitution treatment that it has incredibly positive impacts on people's dependence, but also their social functioning and their employability and their, in the case of opioids, their life expectancy. We've got a real opportunity, I think, with cannabis to treat cannabis use disorder through medicinal cannabis, and I think it's a great shame that there are so many people in the community that are dependent on cannabis and they don't find easy access to treatment. And medicinal cannabis prescribers are a perfect place to provide that sort of healthcare. When David was talking and sort of commenting on the activism of the industry, it kind of reminded me of what I forgot to say in the last slide, which was please reach out to Pennington Institute, reach out to Legalised Cannabis Party, but reach out to Pennington Institute as well if you're interested in these issues and lending your intellectual power, your professional skills or whatever. I think one of the things that Pennington Institute is really keen to do going forward is to bring together many more members of the community, including the expert community in this room, to really put some meat on the bones of what a better future looks like. And that especially includes, I think, much more engagement with the broader community. There's a real risk in drug policy of being isolated and sort of ivory tower, and we're very against that at Pennington Institute, which is why we run International Overdose Awareness Day, which is a community-driven information and awareness-raising campaign with significant elements of anti-stigma. We're trying to save lives, we're trying to end overdose. In a similar pattern, we want to use that model of community engagement with cannabis, and so please do reach out to Pennington Institute. We need all the friends we can get.
Thank you, John, and you've got a lot of friends out there, I know. Please, let's show John that he's our friend.